path that shouldn't exist. The first time Mara heard about the trail was in a grocery line, from a woman who smoothed flour from her hands and said, with a laugh that didn't reach her eyes, "You don't want to go down that way." That laugh lodged itself into the groove of Mara's day. She'd come to the village to verify old boundary lines for a map project, and the notion that a path could exist and not exist at once lodged like a burr. Maps, after all, were supposed to be a kind of truth. Mr. Albright's shop smelled like wood and sugar and 100 years of polite deflection. He kept a pocketed watch and stories folded into the hems of shirts. When Mara asked about the trail, he blinked, then handed her a thin cup of tea as if the question were a small injury. "Not on maps," he said slowly. "Not on ours. But if you must see, go at dusk. It doesn't like midday." His eyes shifted around the shop, as though the shelves might listen. The trail's mouth was narrower than the paper notes suggested, hemmed by brambles reluctant to give way. The stone marker stood half sunken, its carved date soft with lichen and nearly illegible. As Mara stepped onto the path, the world chewed its edges, sounds dulled, the usual bird chatter thinning to a single, drawn-out note. Her phone announced the time, and then a different time, as if two clocks in the same pocket couldn't agree. She told herself that was the point where imagination took over. Curiosity pushed her further. The path did not behave like a line on a map. It folded around hollows and doubled back in ways that felt personal. Twice, Mara glanced back, and the village light seemed farther than it should have been. Twice, she checked maps, and the trail was absent, a gap of white where her boots had left a print. Small things began to misplace themselves: her gloves, then a page from her journal marked with yesterday's date, then a pebble she kept finding in her palm, though she had no memory of picking it up. At the little clearing, the pond sat like a held breath. Its surface was so still it read as glass, but the glass showed more than the sky. It offered a mirror that didn't always obey the world. Mara crouched and saw, at a time when the afternoon should have been sinking into evening, a version of herself with a small, deliberate crease by the left eye, an expression she'd never made in any mirror. The image blinked in ways the pond didn't, as if the reflection lived slightly out of phase. That night, she camped at the edge of the trees because she could not trust her feet to carry her back. The journal opened to a page she'd ripped out months before lay on her lap, inked in a hand too familiar to ignore. Lines she knew she hadn't written stared up, details about a choice she would make next week, scribbles predicting a conversation she would have with Mr. Albright. The air felt like an audience of small, patient things that knew the plot and waited for her to remember her lines. Sleep came in fits. Dreams arrived like visitors who declined to state their business. She dreamed of doors that opened onto other doors, of streets that curved into themselves. Sometimes she woke holding the pale pebble, sometimes with a page folded in her hands. The compass, brass, with its near imperceptible hairline crack, started to worry her less for where it pointed than for where it refused to point. In a dream, it swung to point back at her like an accusing finger. She confronted Mr. Albright the next morning because confrontation is a civilized sort of panic. He listened without interrupting, then slid a small photograph across his counter. It showed the path, but the trees in the photo were younger, and the stone marker bore a clearer symbol, one that matched the faint score on the pebble she kept finding. His voice dropped. "People come back different from how they left," he said. "Some of them don't make much of a story for themselves afterwards." Next afternoon, the map in her bag changed. It wasn't that the ink moved, but when she traced the lines, the pen encountered resistances like small ridges under skin. The path curled inward toward a place that her old survey notes had never mentioned. The compass refused to steady. When she set it down on a stump, the needle spun once, as if uncertain, then pointed toward the village, toward Mr. Albright's shop, as though insisting she learned something she had missed before turning inward again. She began leaving little breadcrumbs for herself, folded slips tucked into bark, small knots tied to branches, dates written on leaves. Each returned with some subtle change, a knot undone though the twine still looped, a date that smudged into a word she didn't recognize. Once, among the roots, she found a journal page in her own handwriting describing a day she hadn't yet lived, a decision she hadn't made. The closer she looked, the more the forest seemed less like a place than like a ledger of choices. There were moments of absurd relief, the trail offering a brief, perfect sunset, a rabbit darting through leaves, then the small betrayals resumed. On one turn, Mara heard the exact echo of her own voice, speaking a half-remembered phrase from her childhood, words she had never spoken aloud in years. It came from somewhere ahead, then behind, as if the curve itself was replaying fragments of her life at different speeds. The sensation pulled at her like an old scar under a shirt, dull, persistent, impossible to ignore. When she reached the clearing again, the pond was no longer simply a mirror. The surface reflected a version of the clearing where small differences stacked. A book left on a stump that wasn't there, mushrooms arranged in a pattern she recognized from a page in her journal. She realized the pond showed possible pasts or plausible presents, like a window into alternate edits of the same scene. The reflection offered possibilities with the casual cruelty of someone showing you what might have been. She reached without thinking and touched the water. The surface held cool resistance and then opened like a shallow memory, not swallowing her but answering. A short sequence played small domestic images, her eating a meal she could not remember cooking, a door whose paint was the wrong color, a photograph on a mantle of people who knew her in a way she didn't. She tore her hand back as if from heat, but the pond kept offering screens, patient and inexhaustible. There was a temptation to stay to learn the sequences shown in the pond, to memorize the ways those lives bent and fold to make sense. Instead, she pocketed the pebble and closed her journal like a door. Leaving, she noticed footprints at the edge of the clearing that did not match her boots. They were smaller, precise, as if someone had walked carefully to mark a route. The footprints trailed back toward the trees and then dissolved into nothing, as if the forest refused to keep their story. When she finally returned to the village, the sky had a pale, unfamiliar angle. Mr. Albright's shop looked the same, but when he opened the ledger, the entries for the day were in her handwriting. "You left something behind," he said quietly, as if offering a pair of shoes found at the roadside. She found her own handwriting cramped and practical in his book. The name and a small notation went forward, sat under today's date. That notation wasn't a sentence she recognized as hers or anyone's. At night, she sat with the journal across her knees and the pebble cold in her palm. The pages held both predictions and regrets, lists of tiny, consequential acts. Answer the knock, leave the lamp on, cross the bridge. Each seemed both trivial and vital. She began to suspect that the path wasn't merely place, but process, a way of rearranging decisions, of letting some lives finish themselves while opening others to begin. The thought sat between her ribs like a loose tooth. In the morning, she left the pebble on the shop counter and told Mr. Albright, "I will go back once, map it properly, then be done." He folded his hands and nodded like a man who'd been told something he'd already known. "Some paths answer when you listen," he said. "Some keep speaking until you learn their grammar." She did not know what grammar he meant. She only knew the path would always be there if she returned, and perhaps even if she did not. She did return, because endings are often just rehearsals for departures. This time, the trail seemed altered in small, indignant ways, as if resentful she'd left. The compass lay still in her palm, needle steady enough to point somewhere she finally trusted less for its direction, and more for the fact it moved at all. When the clearing came, she was ready to look, to watch the pond offer its edits. It did, and she smiled, hollow, because some knowledge is a burden even when it fits. She left the forest with a folded map that no longer matched the ones in her bag, and a pebble gone from a pocket she knew she'd emptied. At home, the photograph on her mantel showed a face that was hers, but carrying a small scar she had not earned. Sometimes, at night, when the house was a flat plane of breathing and the world outside regular and polite, she would hear the faint sound of footsteps not quite behind her, and the map rustle in the drawer like a caged bird. The path had not closed. It simply learned to live inside her.